Denmark may now be the toughest Western fortress in Europe against radical Islam. Not Sweden, not France, not Germany. A nation of roughly 6 million people, smaller than London, has built a wall around its own civilization. Not only a border wall, but a legal, cultural, and political one. Denmark sealed its frontiers, moved against parallel societies, passed sweeping laws targeting so-called ghettos, outlawed full face veils, removed prayer rooms from schools, cut asylum approvals to record lows, and openly rejected the multicultural model spreading across Europe. In 2026, Denmark is no longer asking whether integration will work. It is trying to stop civilizational fragmentation before it begins. And in the spring of 2026, the country took one more step almost nobody saw coming. A step that may rewrite the entire European debate about Islam, integration, and the future of the West itself. To understand how Denmark got here, we have to start somewhere unexpected, because the country drawing the hardest line in Europe was long one of the most open and liberal societies on the continent. For decades, Denmark was the textbook Scandinavian success story. A generous welfare state, world-leading social trust, universal healthcare, free university, and low corruption. Immigration was part of that confidence. Through the 1990s and early 2000s, Danish elites assumed integration would happen on its own. Give newcomers language classes and welfare access, wait a generation, and they would simply become Danes. That was the theory. The reality was very different, and by the middle of the 2000s, authorities were quietly producing reports nobody wanted to read. Unemployment among non-Western immigrants ran several times higher than among native Danes. Only about 55% of children from non-Western backgrounds finished upper secondary education by age 25, against roughly 85% of ethnic Danes. Entire neighborhoods formed where most residents shared neither the language nor the social codes of the country, and welfare dependency in some areas sat at levels that, scaled nationally, would have bankrupted the Danish model. Then the public mood shifted. Ordinary Danes were not hostile to immigrants as people. What terrified them was losing the high-trust social glue that lets a tiny country fund one of the most expensive welfare states on Earth. A Nordic welfare system depends on believing everyone plays by the same rules, and when that belief cracks, the machine grinds. Danes felt the cracks before their politicians admitted them. By 2025, Statistics Denmark put immigrants at roughly 12.6% of the population, about 16% counting their Danish-born children. Next to Sweden, above 27%, that might seem small, but for a once nearly homogeneous society, the change felt seismic. Roughly 270,000 residents trace their roots to Muslim-majority countries, mainly Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and the Balkans, enough to change the texture of entire towns. In certain neighborhoods, the change became impossible to ignore. Mjølnerparken in Copenhagen, Gellerupparken in Aarhus, Valsmose in Odense. Dense estates where unemployment ran near 40%, crime sat well above the national average, and officials admitted in their own documents that a parallel society was forming. Young men from certain backgrounds were convicted of violent offenses at roughly 2.5 times the native rate. Internal reports cataloged honor-based violence, forced marriages, girls kept out of swimming lessons, and informal community courts operating outside Danish law. For a nation built on individual liberty under uniform rules that looked less like diversity and more like a parallel state assembled inside the official one. And then the political class did what almost no other Western European country dared. They named it out loud, and once a government writes a problem into official strategy, every solution becomes politically possible. In 2018, the government unveiled one Denmark without parallel societies. Not a white paper, a war plan. It ranked neighborhoods by unemployment, convictions, education, and income, plus a threshold most governments would never write into law: the share of residents from non-Western backgrounds. Past 50%, with enough criteria met, an area became a parallel society, and after 5 years, a transformation area. A ghetto list had existed since 2010, but now the response changed. Instead of pouring in money, the state decided to physically restructure the neighborhoods. Housing associations had to cut social housing by 40% by 2030. That meant demolitions, forced sales to developers, leases not renewed, families uprooted from estates they had lived in for decades so the buildings could be torn down to break the demographic composition of the area. Around it came smaller but pointed rules. Daycare became effectively mandatory in listed areas so the state could shape language exposure from day one. Penalties were doubled inside the zones. even for identical crimes on opposite sides of a single street. Welfare tightened, citizenship stiffened, with a demanding test and a values contract required since 2016. Ministers said openly that parallel societies were not a challenge to manage, but a threat to eliminate. The most famous battleground was Molnarparken. To the state, it was a parallel society. Long-term residents, many naturalized citizens, were told to leave. Some refused, and protests grew. By 2024, the list had fallen from 12 to 8. The government called it progress. Evicted residents called it something else. The case reached the European Court of Justice, where an advocate general said the scheme amounted to direct discrimination by ethnic origin. And in December 2025, the court ruled the law may breach anti-discrimination rules. Denmark shrugged, called the opinion non-binding, and the demolitions continued. That was only one front, because the deeper question was what kind of country Denmark was defending. The answer politicians kept giving was one where two strangers can look each other in the face. Which brings us to the veil. In May 2018, Parliament voted 75-30 to ban garments covering the face in public. On paper, it named no religion. In practice, everyone knew it meant the niqab and the burqa. The Justice Minister called hiding the face incompatible with Danish values. A line in the sand. Only around 150 to 200 women in the country wore the full veil, and critics called fines and possible jail time for them symbolic and cruel. Ministers did not deny it, arguing that symbols mark the boundary of what a society will accept. Roughly 72% of Danes backed the ban. Amnesty International called it a violation of women's rights, and a United Nations body ruled that enforcement breached international obligations. The Danish answer never changed. Noted, and we are not changing course. It was not the first such fight. In 2014, Denmark effectively ended ritual slaughter for kosher and halal meat by requiring stunning first, with the agriculture minister telling critics that animal rights come before religion. When religious accommodation collides with a secular value, the secular value wins. From 2023, the government moved to phase prayer rooms out of schools and universities, with Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen calling democracy and secularism non-negotiable foundations of Danish life. Critics noted Christian holidays remained untouched. The government pointed to public support and moved on, while also tightening rules on foreign-funded mosques and extending hate speech laws to preachers of any nationality. If you preach in Denmark, you preach in Denmark. You preach inside Danish rules. Quietly, the asylum lever tightened too. Since 2019, the Social Democrats committed openly to a zero-refugee policy. In 2024, Denmark received 2,333 applications and approved only 860, and by late 2025, just 839 approvals for the year, historically low. British officials calculated Danish policy had pushed claims to a 40-year low, with about 95% of rejected applicants actually removed. In January 2026, the immigration minister said it was absolutely critical that as few foreigners as possible obtain asylum. Denmark had already declined to renew permits for over 1,200 Syrians after declaring parts of Damascus safe, legalized processing claims outside Europe, and deliberately become one of the least attractive destinations on the continent through lower benefits, temporary protection, and tight family reunification. The strangest part was who drove it, because in most of Europe, hardline immigration politics belongs to the right. In Denmark, the architect was the center-left. Frederiksen and the Social Democrats outflanked everyone, absorbing the Danish People's Party agenda into mainstream governance and framing the shift as defense of the welfare state. Not an attack on Muslims. Either the welfare state goes or the open door goes. The argument ran, and the Social Democrats picked the door. The result was near total consensus that no majority party would return to the open era. That is why the model is so hard to dismantle. On March 25, 2026, Danes voted. Frederiksen was expected to coast to a third term. Instead, the Social Democrats scored 21.9%, their worst result since 1903, leaving 12 parties and no majority for either bloc. Frederiksen negotiated for weeks, and it collapsed. On May 9th, King Frederick X asked Liberal leader Troels Lund Poulsen to build a center-right government. In the talks that followed, the Danish People's Party offered support tied to far stricter policy, with rhetoric describing net immigration reduced to the point of long-term population decline among certain immigrant groups. Not lower immigration, not stricter integration, but active departure. A center-left prime minister adopted the hardest regime in Western Europe, won 2 elections on it, absorbed her far-right opposition, and still lost power to a coalition that found her not nearly hard enough. The Overton window did not just shift. It cracked open. Meanwhile, Europe began copying the playbook. In November 2025, Britain unveiled its biggest asylum overhaul in modern times, scrapping the failed Rwanda scheme, replacing permanent refugee status with temporary protection, and citing Copenhagen by name. Sweden, once Denmark's humane opposite, switched sides with applications down roughly 60% since 2022, and ministers describing a Danish-style model. Dutch, Austrian, and German politicians cite the Danish model. The European Commission treats Danish policy as a case study, and Italy cites it defending its offshore experiment with Albania. What is being copied is not one law. It is a way of arguing, a way of saying out loud what governments spent 2 decades refusing to say. Underneath every law sits one idea that a small high-trust welfare society cannot survive unlimited fragmentation, because the system only works if people believe they share something with their neighbors. Remove that, and the welfare state eventually collapses, not because anyone abolishes it, but because nobody will pay for it. In the Danish telling, this is not about hating Muslims, but defending a civilizational project that cannot be renegotiated every generation. Critics call it a polite mask for ethnic engineering, pointing to the demolitions, the bans, and the non-Western threshold in housing law. And they call it soft authoritarianism in Scandinavian design. Supporters point to the asylum numbers, falling welfare costs, political stability, and the fact that nearly every major government is borrowing the approach, arguing Denmark simply did first what everyone will eventually be forced to do. Both sides agree on one thing. Denmark is not backing down. It is doubling down, and the continent is no longer laughing. It is studying. Whatever you think of the Danish answer, the Danish question is now everyone's question. How much cultural fragmentation can a modern Western state absorb before something it depends on? But rarely names, quietly breaks. Denmark answered with specific numbers, specific neighborhoods, and specific laws. Most of Europe has not even agreed on the question. Is Denmark right? Did a tiny Nordic country see the future 10 years early and act while there was still time? Or did it just give the West permission to dismantle the multicultural project Europe spent 70 years building? Tell us in the comments.